Welcome to the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.
Endless journey of delight and profitability.
I think some people use it as a derogatory term towards accountants.
Being visible to the employees is important.
Hey, podcast listeners, welcome back for another episode on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast. I'm Derek Kelly, and of course with me is Tara Hollwegner.
Hi, listeners.
So today's a great episode, and something great about working with podcasts is that you don't always have to have the person right next to you while you're having the conversation. And so this is kind of our first call over the phone with Wally Wilson. Wally, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for joining us. And so Wally is a senior subject matter expert in materials management, work management, planning, and scheduling at Lifecycle Engineering. So Wally has more than 30 years of experience in plant management with Fortune 500 corporations. He's helped both domestic and international clients. So he's got just a long list of experiences. So that's why he'll be on this podcast talking about how to combat the growing risk of counterfeit parts. So we're going to highlight the safety concerns and added cost of using counterfeit parts in your maintenance activities and kind of how to reduce the risk of receiving those counterfeit parts. So let's get right into it, Wally. So we as consumers, we're constantly hear about counterfeit money. So how often are maintenance personnel hearing about counterfeit parts?
In the travels that I've had, a lot of the maintenance folks don't really know about the counterfeit parts. You know, they know that the parts aren't lasting as long as they should. The service life isn't there. And usually the excuse is, well, purchasing's buying the cheapest parts they can, which, you know, kind of opens the door for counterfeit parts and all these sub-performance repair parts to get into the system. From that aspect there, that's where the maintenance personnel are aware, very limited awareness though, that, you know, they just know their parts aren't lasting like they should.
Is this becoming a more prevalent concern for manufacturing professionals?
Oh, absolutely. You know, some of the things that are being counterfeited in the MRO world are mainly bearings, valves, electronics, and you know, these things here aren't just that their service life is less. A lot of it poses a safety danger to the employees that are using this equipment. If you have a bearing that you think is new or is made of subpar material and you put it into application and, you know, it malfunctions, you know, I've seen pieces of equipment completely come off of their base. And, you know, when it does that, the people in the area are probably going to get injured in some way or another. So it is a big concern for manufacturing,
well,
just for the safety aspect.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that we're calling these parts what they are. They're counterfeit parts, which, you know, the connotation of that is it's not something good. It's something that can be dangerous. So I'd just like to hear a little bit more. You talked about it a little bit, but can you tell me more about how counterfeit parts affect equipment performance and the cost of maintenance of that equipment? I mean, if they're not lasting long, I'm assuming that means that they have to be purchased and replaced more often, which costs not only the purchase price, but the cost of downtime and maintenance.
Yeah. You know, those two areas there, everybody's worried about their P&L statement, their profit and loss statement, and downtime is definitely going to affect it. Injuries to employees, as far as workman's comp, definitely affects the bottom line. So, you know, there's a lot of factors. There's several factors that come into play when you start talking about counterfeit parts. Equipment performance. You know, if you're doing repetitive repairs on a piece of equipment because of the repair parts are failing, then you're going to have excessive downtime and a lot of unplanned maintenance to deal with. And the cost, you know, if you're buying, you know, cheaper parts, I guess I could use that term, cheaper parts, the incidence of failure could eat up that savings that you think you're getting by not getting the actual parts. And from an aspect of a maintenance manager, looking at counterfeit parts, you know, there's so many issues as far as, you know, they want to make sure the equipment's up and running. And it's a negative perception of their ability to maintain the equipment when they have repetitive failures because, you know, who are you going to blame? You go right back and you go to the person that's doing the maintenance on the piece of equipment and not looking at the actual root cause.
Explain more about how this can actually cause harm and kind of be deadly. Talk about that side of things.
Well, usually when, like a bearing fails, the bearing seizes up or something like that, it's going to probably tear up the shaft on the motor or the gearbox or the pump or whatever it's in, which is going to cause collateral damage, because when the pump goes, the motor is probably going to get destroyed in the process. So it's not just the piece of equipment that you're using these parts in; it's the collateral damage. And again, I always go back to the safety factor, because if you've got folks out there that are working around equipment and involved with equipment that isn't designed for the application, you're running a high risk of equipment failure, but also damage or injury to your employees.
If Joe Smith walks into a storeroom to retrieve a part, how is he able to identify, or how can he identify whether or not that part is actually authentic or a fake?
That is a very difficult thing to do. I know the major manufacturers are running all these different methods, different ways to identify these parts before they get into the supply chain. But, U.S. Customs, they're involved in checking these things also. But the counterfeiters have gotten so good that they can pretty much so just by visual inspection can fool even the bearing manufacturers. They've got it down to where they can laser the part number, the manufacturer's part number, right on the race of the bearing or on the housing of the bearing. They can duplicate even the packaging. I had an instance with a client here recently that we had the bearing manufacturer come in and look at the parts, the bearings that they had in stock, and over a third of them, well over a third, were parts or bearings that they had no idea where they came from, or they said the packaging was nothing like they'd ever seen. So as these counterfeiters are getting better, it's more and more difficult to identify these parts, these issues. We're not talking about handbags here, or
well, that's what I was just thinking. Like an email that looks like it's coming from FedEx, it's really not. It's got a virus in it, or my Prada that I might have bought on the street in Washington D.C. These is totally different implications.
I mean, if you're getting a fake Rolex watch and it doesn't perform, you get upset, but it's a counterfeit, it. And but when you get a counterfeit bearing or you get a counterfeit valve and that thing fails, and the contents is some kind of an acid or something like that, anybody in the area can be injured. You can be down for excessive lengths of time if that part or that piece of equipment is a critical part to your production process.
So a little bit more serious consequences than getting a fake Prada bag.
Sure, just to save a couple of bucks on the purchase price, you end up paying a lot more in terms of downtime, collateral damage, and hopefully nothing worse than that. So, Wally, what can be done to reduce the risk of purchasing these counterfeits?
It all starts with your the supply chain and having preferred suppliers that you can trust and have a partnership with those suppliers, because if you're looking at your mean time between repairs and you're looking at condition-based monitoring and all this different methodology as far as maintaining your equipment, those things will throw the red flag. We like to find these things before, at least prevent them from getting into the supply chain or into the storeroom where these parts are being held and ready to go into service. If we can back it up, the supply chain, to the purchasing function, and having the purchasing folks actually certifying the suppliers, using preferred suppliers that have been vetted and understand where these parts are coming from, and like I said, have the partnership with them, that if we have a failure, we can go to them and say, hey, this bearing failed in a short amount of time. Can you check it out? And they're, every one of them that I have talked to or that I've had any kind of relationship with is more than happy to conduct those analysis on failed equipment or failed pieces of failed parts. So it's something that it's after the fact, but purchasing, I kind of lay it at the doorstep of those folks, because they're the ones that monitor what comes into the site. And having preferred suppliers that you got a partnership with and you can trust is a good starting point.
So I know that in our reliability excellence model, we have materials management and procurement. They're very intermingled in terms of how their relationships with the supply chain and with what comes in and out and what's being used in the plant. So I know that's something that we discuss frequently. And also you mentioned the partnerships with suppliers. So that strategic sourcing is going to be key to helping you not even let these counterfeit parts get near your doorstep.
Absolutely. I mean, you really summarized that great, Tara. That it comes down to understanding, and the cheapest part isn't necessarily, in 99% of the time, going to be the best part. If you can get a bearing, say from Temkin or SKF, or somebody that the bearing is the actual, made of the right component, made of the right material, everything is right with it, it's going to last probably 3 to 4 times as long as one of these counterfeit bearings. These counterfeit bearings a lot of times are remanufactured. They're old bearings that are taken, cleaned up, repacked, placed in a nice new box, and shipped out as a new part. You can buy an SKF bearing here, and it's costing you, say, $350, and you go to Amazon and you look on there, and there's that same bearing. Gosh, they got it for $35. That's where the planners and the purchasing folks seem to go, is to Amazon and some of these eBay and some of those websites that they can get these cheap parts. And I would say, if anything, get the planners out of sourcing parts, and get the purchasing folks doing the sourcing and qualifying of these suppliers.
Buyer beware, and listen to your RE and your bill of materials, right?
Yes. And you got to monitor the meantime between repairs for your equipment. If you're expecting, say, 36 months out of a bearing before you have to go back in and reinstall this bearing or replace it, and you're only getting maybe 8 or 9 months, that's a huge red flag. And that's the case in a lot of these counterfeit parts.
Wally, so you've made mention to these bearings being often replicated. And so I just want to know, is that what you're finding out there? Or is that what the studies show us, that these bearings are the most replicated? Or is there some other part to be aware of more specifically than just bearings?
In my research, that seems to be probably the most counterfeited part. But you're also seeing it in valves, and it's the repair parts that go into a motor. It's not necessarily they're counterfeiting a Gould pump or they're a Baldor motor. It's more they're counterfeiting the repair parts like the bearings and the seals and that kind of stuff that goes into these units. And so when they're repaired, you think you've got a like new piece of component there, and when you put it in service, you're not going to get the performance. So even though you keep it, you laser align it, you do everything just the way you're supposed to do, you keep it lubed the way it's supposed to be lubed, 9 times out of 10, you probably put a used bearing or a substandard bearing into that component.
All right, listeners, I think with that, we're going to end today's episode. We just spoke with Wally Wilson and how to combat the growing risk of counterfeit parts. So just a quick recap of what we discussed today. We talked about how counterfeit parts are becoming more of a growing concern for manufacturing facilities. We also talked about how this affects the equipment performance as well as the cost of maintenance for that equipment that's affected by these counterfeit parts. Also, we discussed counterfeit parts and the identification of those. It's becoming really hard these days to be able to pick out what's a fake and what's authentic, just because of how well these counterfeiters are doing in packaging and branding these parts as authentic. And then finally, we wrapped up talking about how to reduce the risk of purchasing fake parts. So it was an excellent conversation. So happy to have you on today, Wally. We really hope you enjoyed yourself as well.
Oh, yeah, it was great. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely, Wally. Well, take care, and thank you for listening to the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.
Thanks, Wally. Thanks, listeners. Bye-bye.
Hey, listeners, one more thing before you go. If you have any feedback for the show, or you have maybe some suggestions for upcoming topics you'd love to hear about, we'd like to hear from you. So there's 2 ways to get in contact with us. The first is on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @LCE_today, so be sure to follow us. And then the other way is to email the show at podcast@lce.com. Once again, thank you for joining the show, and we look forward to more episodes on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.